The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the David Pakman Show. Hi to everyone who is with us live on YouTube. We're live every Monday through Thursday, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific, including, I want to say hi to everyone from the We Survive Bush, You'll Survive Obama Facebook page and the I Love It When I Wake Up in the Morning and Barack Obama is President Facebook page. Check both of those out. A lot to talk about today. Of course, we will talk about the new Pope, but I'm going to wait since we're going to talk to Dennis Campbell about that later on in the hour. So I will reserve my comments about that for at least a few minutes. There's an interesting story that's come to my attention. There's an article on Salon.com about this, about the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, reversing a decision about water pollution after a lobbyist got involved. Now, we've talked on the program a lot, Lewis, about the corruption within the FDA, both as it comes to the food part of Food and Drug Administration, as well as the drug part of the Food and Drug Administration, different types of corruption, have we not?
Right, all the time.
So the EPA is not immune from, apparently, this same type of corruption. Now, the backstory on this is that there is a company called Uranium Energy Corporation, which wanted permission to start a pretty big mining project in Goliad County, Texas. And initially, the EPA was not going to allow it. And the reason for this is that to get the ore out of the ground, the company needed, basically, it's a permit to pollute, okay? And what would they have been polluting? A very clean, some say pristine supply of underground drinking water in an area that already has been having drought problems. We've talked about the drought issues that are plaguing some parts of the country.
Right.
So in addition to this, the EPA scientists were worried that the radioactive contaminants used at the mining site would flow into the water, which then is the supply, the water wells that are used by homes that are nearby. Uranium Energy said the pollution would remain contained, but they didn't want to do advanced testing about it. They didn't want to model it for the government the way it was requested. So late 2011 seems like it's DOA, dead on arrival. It's just not going to happen. They're not going to get the permit to pollute. What happens then? Well, Uranium Energy hires Heather Podesta. Now, Heather Podesta is a lobbyist and a pretty well-known Democratic fundraiser who has a lot of pull with the Obama administration. And the Washington Post actually had an article about her where they called her the Capitol's latest it girl. She is the sister-in-law of John Podesta, who co-chaired President Obama's transition team. And now Heather Podesta went straight to the EPA's second-in-command, Bob Percasepi, and basically got involved directly. Now, lo and behold, we don't know the details of exactly what happened there, but by the end of 2012, the EPA reversed its position on in Goliad County, Texas, and they approved an exemption which allows Uranium Energy to pollute this aquifer. And it's in a smaller area than was initially proposed, but what a change, what a turnover. The EPA spokesperson that was asked about this said that companies routinely lobby the agency on different regulatory issues and that Podesta's approaches to the EPA did not play a role in the final decision. Now, this, when I read it, okay, maybe that's true in this particular case, but you always hear this. You always hear, listen, companies give money, but politicians never do anything based on having received that money. Lobbyists, they do stuff, but it didn't play a part in the decisions the government made. This is such obvious BS because if lobbying didn't work, there wouldn't be hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe billions, I don't know the total, spent on lobbying every single year. In other words, why would you do it if it didn't work?
Right, that's true. But can we 100% definitively say that that's what happened in this case?
We cannot say that. And of course, the EPA is denying it. Of course, Uranium Energy is denying it because that's obviously what they would do. But the data is very, very concerning. And let's be honest, uranium in your drinking water, a few thousand years of radioactivity in the aquifer, we should be questioning whether permits to do that type of pollution should even be on the table, forgetting about whether a lobbyist influenced this.
Yeah, well, they are on the table. I mean, who can we blame that on? That might go back a ways, but yeah, I think we can all agree that this doesn't look good.
Disturbing stuff for sure. The Family Research Council, one of our favorite and most well-known anti-gay groups, says that we should punish premarital sex because, hey, we never gave young people the right to do it. Who is we? I don't know. Not clear.
Maybe the Family Research Council.
Maybe that's what they mean. Maybe they are the authority for allowing or not allowing premarital sex. So this happened a couple days ago when FRC senior fellow Pat Fagan was guest hosting on Washington Watch, and he argued that the 1972 Supreme Court case Eisenstadt versus Baird, which overturned a Massachusetts law which banned the distribution of contraceptives to unmarried couples, was the, quote, single most destructive decision in the history of the court. And basically they're making the case, like I said, that we should be punishing people who have premarital sex. Let's listen to the audio from this incredible broadcast, Lewis.
Court decided that single people had the right to contraceptives.
Right.
What's that got to do with marriage? Well, everything. Because what the Supreme Court essentially said is single people have the right to engage in sexual intercourse. Well, societies have always done that. There were laws against it. Now, sure, single people are inclined to push the fences and jump over them, particularly if they're in love with each other and going on to marriage, but they always knew they were doing wrong. In this case, the Supreme Court said, take those fences away, they can do whatever they like. And they didn't address at all what status children had, what status the commons had. By commons, I mean the rest of the United States.
Right.
Have they got any standing in this case? They just said, no, singles have the right to contraceptive, which means singles have the right to sex outside of marriage. Brushing aside millennia, thousands and thousands of years of wisdom, tradition, culture, and setting in motion what we have. It's not the contraception. That's it. Everybody thinks this is about contraception. What this court case said was young people have the right to engage in sex outside of marriage. Society never gave young people that right. Functioning societies don't do that. They stop it. They punish it. They corral people. They shame them. They do whatever.
There's so much here.
What century is this guy living in?
We could do an
Even
hour.
when he was born, things weren't that crazy.
Let's unpack a number of different things. Number one, society and the giving of rights. Number one, if something is really a right, it is not imperative on society to give the right. Right? In other words, it just so obviously doesn't make sense. But
Every single thing he said was false.
If we talk about the tradition argument, he says, well, listen, we've got millennia of tradition where people were shamed for sex outside of marriage. The millennia are insignificant when you look at the course of human history. Think about that, Lewis. Think about the course of human history and what impact 2,000 years really has. Now, understandably, when we look at, well, listen, in the last 50 years, we do things in the medical world this way. There, it's a little bit different because you say, well, we just didn't have the capability or technology that we did a long time ago. But Natan, what do you think of this argument that he says, hey, tradition is that we shame people for sex outside of marriage over the last 2,000 years. Therefore, nobody has that right. Nobody has the right to do that.
I couldn't care less what tradition says about this. What the Constitution says and what the court responded to in 1972 was that the government has absolutely no business telling people what they should do. So it only makes sense to analyze this in those terms. Anything else is just religious dogma.
Is it really that simple, Lewis? Because you have a minute and 51 seconds, that clip there, of literally nonsense. I mean, it is garbage arguments that don't stand up legally. They don't stand up scientifically. They don't stand up intellectually. They only seem to be valid.
They don't stand up historically.
Then they don't stand up historically. They only seem to stand up in this sort of twilight weird world of the Family Research Council and other right-wing groups. Maybe it's a simple argument of, listen, the Constitution has absolutely no, there's nothing there that would suggest that people should be, couples outside of marriage or individuals outside of a marriage should be denied anything in terms of decisions they make about their sexuality, period, end of story. Maybe it's that simple.
I think it is pretty simple. I mean, clearly these people just live in a bubble. A bubble, maybe you could call it the Bible. I don't know. I mean, they live in a bubble, and who knows if he did any research of what's happening, what is actually happening in other societies and other countries.
This is an example of a Christian version of the Sharia law that these types claim to oppose, right? That's what this is.
This is American Taliban. That's all it is.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Samantha Del Valle California mother has been arrested after her 2-year-old son tested positive for meth. She's a California resident, and she and her boyfriend, named Raymond Mabry, were arrested a few days ago on charges of child endangerment after Del Valle's 2-year-old son was found to have dangerous levels of alcohol and methamphetamines in his bloodstream. Now, if he had lower levels of alcohol and methamphetamine, maybe it's not a big deal for a 2-year-old, but the levels were dangerously high, Lewis.
Well, I have to say, either way, I believe something terrible is happening here.
The toddler was taken to Ukiah Valley Medical Center by his grandmother, who noticed that the kid just didn't appear to be okay, smelled like alcohol after she picked him up from Del Valle's home. And when sheriff's deputies searched the home, they found that the mother, 22 years old, and the boyfriend, 21 years old, were intoxicated. There was drug paraphernalia all over in areas easily accessible by a child. It is not clear whether the child was able to imbibe the alcohol and use the meth because of the way in which they were not appropriately stored. I don't know what the proper way to store meth is. I'm not familiar. Or whether the mom and the boyfriend actually gave this to the child. But in either case, the arrests happened. The boyfriend was released on $25,000 bail. Del Valle remains incarcerated. Both are scheduled for a court hearing. This is not that unusual. Earlier this year, we didn't cover this story, but there is another story of a woman in Washington state who was arrested after her 2-year-old died from ingesting a deadly amount of meth. You know where I'm going with this. We can talk about the specifics here, but we've had this conversation in the past. Should you need some kind of license or to pass a test to be a parent? You need one to drive, you need one to hunt, you need one to fish, you need one to be in business. You should need one to own a gun, not always the case. Isn't having children one of the things that has the most influence on the world around you? Bringing a person into the world who then can do any number of things. The counter argument to that, and it's not a bad counter argument, is that whatever system we can reasonably expect to set up would disproportionately prevent minorities and poor people from having children and would be inherently, structurally discriminatory. I'll let you go first on this, Lewis.
For sure. It would end up being that way. I mean, let's face it, there's never going to be a license to be a parent. But what if, let's say, when you go to your first doctor's appointment, when you realize you're pregnant, they say, well, we need to take down your information and someone is going to be sent to your home just to scout it out, look around, and see if you're fit to have a child there.
Almost like if you wanted to adopt a child.
Like basically Child Protective Services, right?
Okay.
Right, like if you wanted to adopt. And then what happens? If they deem you unfit to have a child there, they say this child needs to live with another family member or this child is going to be, put in foster care.
Forced abortion?
Well,
we're opening up a lot of cans of worms here.
Yeah.
Let me get Natan in on this. Natan, do you think that there should be some kind of test that has to be passed, some minimum requirement? And is there any way to avoid the disproportionate effect it will have on the poor and on minorities?
No and no. And I might add that I think it's pretty difficult to square supporting that kind of a policy and not having that be completely inconsistent with the story we just covered.
Explain.
Well, we just criticized a guy for basically imposing his dogma into people's sexual lives, and this is basically the same thing.
Right. Well, that's the other thing, right? Which is any requirements or standards that are created would by definition be just as subjective, arguably, as those of a group like the Family Research Council, and therefore wouldn't there be inherent bias in any system that is set up?
There would be. It would have to be pretty loose. I mean, I think basically what it would come down to is there drugs, alcohol, and feces, and or something similar.
What about urine?
Well, there's always feces.
In terms of mess. Well, you might not spot that.
Okay.
In terms of monitor the cleanliness and substances of a home, it would have to be very loose restrictions. But
I think that this is totally insane.
It'll never happen.
It's just a hypothetical. It will never happen, and I don't believe that it should. But I think it's an interesting conversation. Natan getting visibly angered by it.
I mean, if it were to happen, that's how it would go. It will never happen. Obviously,
I think you guys should realize that this is the exact type of insane religious policy. And when I say religious, I don't mean just the church, but a sort of dogmatic policy that we criticize again and again on this show.
Oh, I
when
completely
it comes
agree.
to everything.
I completely agree.
Yeah.
So then the next question would be, okay, given that type of thing is not going to happen and doesn't make sense, what do we do to prevent this type of situation where parents have 2-year-olds who are on meth, Natan?
Well, I mean, I think we should do a number of things regarding educating parents,
right,
and getting the government to fund community programs to prevent this from happening and to stop it from happening once it started. But that has absolutely no bearing on whether people should be able to have kids.
You just don't want people ending up like this. So how do you fix that? You support the middle class and the lower class, right? You increase the minimum wage, maybe. You have better social programs and better education. That's it. That's all you need to do. You need to prevent this from happening. You can't prevent people who are messed up like this from having children.
Send me your thoughts on this. Very curious what you have to say about it. On today's bonus show, we're going to talk about, speaking of children and drugs, some children were hospitalized after eating what was allegedly a pot-laced brownie. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about a new Mars rover discovery. And also, this is a pretty interesting new development, a self-healing computer microchip and what the implications might be. If you don't get the bonus show, it's very easy. Just go to our website, davidpakman.com/membership. Sign up for membership. You'll support the show. You'll get the bonus show and lots of great benefits. We'll be back with plenty more after this. Stay with us.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to have you with us today on the David Pakman Show. Please consider subscribing to the David Pakman Show as a member, made possible in part by liberalbias.com. Liberalbias.com refuses to have their theories and graphs dictated by fact checkers. Find out how you, too, can free yourself from the oppression of liberal facts at liberalbias.com. Today's new member of the day is Kevin Hamlin. Kevin, thank you. Thank you so much for becoming a David Pakman Show member. We couldn't do it without you and all other David Pakman Show members. Here's something interesting. A Fox News guest named Caroline Heldman said that she has never met a group of people who are so upset that the economy is rebounding than the people over at Fox News right now. And this, to kind of set this up for you, Caroline Heldman was recently on the Hannity Show. She had a little bit of a blow-up with Sean Hannity, where he was arguing correctly that a booming stock market is not a sign of economic recovery because, hey, people on food stamps are not investing in the stock market. Now, this is a brilliant argument. It's actually one I've made, many progressives have made. Problem is, it's not an argument that conservatives ever made when George W. Bush was in the White House, and just in general when they talk about the benefits of the stock market doing better. So I'll play for you this bit of the Hannity Show, and then we'll talk about what Heldman said on MSNBC. I think it was the day after this appearance. Take a look at this.
You know, but the number's even bigger than that, Kerry, because it's 18 million more Americans. 1 in 6 Americans are in poverty. Now, you hear Nancy Pelosi, others talking about the stock market. Do any of those people on food stamps, are they investing in the stock market, Caroline? Anybody there?
You know,
I tend to doubt
I'm really impressed. I'm impressed that you're now concerned about the poor. Thank you for that. But the fact of the matter is,
you know what
you are doing is like
only Democrats care about poor people. Only Democrats want clean air and water. Only Democrats care about not killing old people. You're right.
Well, you know, unfortunately, I would agree with you on most of those points. But what you're doing is like...
Okay, so after this appearance, Caroline Heldman went on, I believe it was the Al Sharpton show, and she said, you know what? There is this group of people over at Fox News that just does not know what to do because the economy is improving. Now, I've talked about, and a number of people have talked about, a number of the issues. So wages are up slightly, but they're not keeping up nearly with the rise in the stock market. And of course, stock ownership is concentrated overwhelmingly among the wealthiest individuals. And there's a number of economic problems. But we absolutely cannot deny that over the first term of President Obama, and since the swearing in for the second term, the economy has been improving, and Fox News just doesn't know what to do. They're so upset about it.
Right. Well, all they can do is say, well, look how bad everything else is.
The next thing we'll hear, if unemployment gets down to 6% under President Obama, we can turn on Fox and see them saying, President Obama is overheating the economy. He's endangering us all because the economy is doing so well. We now risk inflation. It's a disaster. We need Obama out. He's a Muslim Kenyan socialist.
Yeah, they'll just have to distract. They won't go that far. They will start talking about other things. What will they talk about? I don't know. Maybe Obamacare again. Who knows?
Let me talk. Speaking of cable news, there's a disgusting statistic about the coverage of the sequester and the automatic cuts that's been happening on cable news. This is out of Think Progress. I encourage you to take a look at all the data. Since the sequester, we've seen a lot of stories, thousands and thousands of stories about different cuts that are happening as a result of the sequester, of the automatic cuts. Mainstream media has been almost to a point of being almost like a fetish, obsessed with the cuts to White House tours. This is something that started circulating that, wow, well, listen, the White House tours are not going to be able to continue for the public. Kids, their classes, they're not going to be able to have a tour of the White House because of the sequester cuts. In fact, as Ari Melber of The Nation pointed out yesterday, there have been 12,000 news stories related to the White House tours and how the White House tours may not continue because of the sequester cuts, and less than 1,000 stories on cable news about the impact on housing assistance programs, which, of course, disproportionately affect low-income Americans, and all of the other social programs that are being cut. It's incredible. I'm not surprised, but when you look at the numbers, 12,000 versus less than 1,000, it's incredible. Now, Think Progress looked at three major cable networks, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, since March 6th. White House tours were mentioned 33 times as often as mentions of other sequester impacts hitting the poor. Any discussion of sequestration's steep cuts to housing assistance, food stamps, and Head Start early education was virtually non-existent on all three networks in the same time frame. Fox News mentioned Head Start 3 times. Education mentioned only 3 times. Ignored housing and food stamps altogether. MSNBC mentioned Head Start 4 times. Food stamps once. Did not cover the housing assistance cuts. CNN silent on all 3 issues. What do you guys make of this? I mean, we've seen so much backlash, and you know, people talk about, liberal media, conservative media, so on and so forth. Number one, the White House tour cuts have been a Republican-driven story, and the media has latched onto it to the tune of 12,000 stories, as we mentioned, 12,000 mentions. And remember, White House tours are something that, by and large, disproportionately affect not the poorest, right? It's true there are some poor school districts that raise money to go to the White House and have a tour. That's true. But mostly, if you're going to the White House to have a tour, you're able to travel to Washington. There's a number of other things. All of these other programs that aren't being mentioned are programs for poor people. Disgusting. Absolutely disgusting.
Now, is this just an unfortunate consequence of these major networks picking stories that they think people want to hear about?
Natan, what do you think about that? It's a chicken egg scenario. What is the driver here? I believe that this is a story that was handpicked by Republicans. I started hearing this several weeks ago, Republicans saying, White House tours are being cut, blah, blah, blah. And then the media responded in a frenzy to that. But maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think we live in a culture where some organization with a specific political interest will put out a press release. It'll get repeated verbatim for all the media sources across the country, and then it'll just be reported as such without any change in the official line. I think that's what's happening here. Although I will say that I could come up with an argument to defend White House tours, which is that in contrast to all the other programs that get cut, except for maybe some of the defense cuts, a lot of tourists who come to the U.S. and want to go to the White House and they get shut out, they're going to go back home and say, oh my God, they treat foreign tourists so badly. You go to the White House, they don't even give you a tour.
It's a perfectly fine argument to make, Natan, but the reality, Louis, is that the U.S. is doing so many other things that are of much more concern in terms of our image around the world than not giving people tours of the White House, that I can't say that is really that compelling of an argument.
Yeah. I mean, let's be honest here. The Smithsonian is way more interesting. But yeah, I mean, overall, we just have, obviously, a continuing failure by the mainstream media to report on important issues.
Absolutely sickening. Yeah. Let me go back to a story I wasn't able to get to in the first segment, Natan, about this gay principal. The Gresham Barlow School District in Oregon is forcing an openly gay elementary school principal out of his job at the end of the school year. The principal says, Tom Klansnick, that it is because of his sexual orientation. So a couple of years ago, Klansnick divorced his wife and told teachers and parents that he is gay. And then last spring, the school board voted not to extend his contract beyond this school year. Thursday night, the school board reconfirmed that they are going to get rid of him at the end of the year. they took 2 public votes over this without any public discussion. Now, the officials from the Gresham Barlow School District are saying we don't talk about personnel matters, and by law, employee personnel records are private, period. That's it. We're not going to discuss it. Now, Parker says, a parent says that she has no idea why the district is getting rid of this individual, this principal, says that she knows that the school's performance record is very good. There's nothing to suggest problems with the performance, and that it doesn't sound crazy to think that coming out as gay has triggered this action. Now, Klansnick's attorney obviously is saying that that she believes there is discrimination here. The problem here, we don't know all the data. So I can't say this is or isn't because this individual came out as gay. The problem in general with employment law, and I've talked to a number of employment attorneys over the years about different stories and different things, is that there are often many laws in place to protect people from discrimination, from discriminatory practices, but they are very, very hard to enforce because motive can be very hard to prove. In other words, the timing somewhat matches up, even though it's a couple of years ago that he came out and now his contract's not being renewed. But how do you prove that? How do you prove that? And this applies also to, we've talked about questions you're not allowed to ask during a job interview, and therefore issues on which you can't decide to hire or not to hire someone, including sexual orientation, but if they're married, if they plan to have children, so many other things. But the reality is that who really knows if you don't hire someone, if you've not hired them because of one of the things that's on the list that are not allowed. So I don't really know what's going to happen in this case. I hope that there is more to the story, and there is some legitimate reason for why his contract isn't being renewed. It's just very difficult to enforce this type of thing and to prove motive.
Right, unless you have people with evidence that someone making the decision said something on record, that it was about that. I mean, it's basically impossible.
Absolutely. And of course, if that were the case, you would think that the records would be scrubbed pretty clean.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Make sure to pick up a David Pakman Show t-shirt, hoodie, or zip-up hoodie. Lewis is wearing the t-shirt right now. davidpakman.com/gear. All of our apparel is made from 100% recycled materials, and of course, ships free within the U.S. We'll take a break. Next, we will talk about the new Pope, Pope Francis, with Dennis Campbell. Stay tuned for that, and a lot more still coming up.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's Thursday, and joining me today for Worldview with Dennis Campbell is Dennis Campbell, editor-in-chief of UK Progressive Magazine, also host of Worldview Show on YouTube, youtube.com/Worldview Show. So, Dennis, we have a new Pope, Pope Francis, of course, formerly Cardinal Bergoglio from Argentina, my home country. Even though I'm an Argentinian Jew, I was getting people congratulating me about the new Pope. I wasn't really sure how to react, and I was actually thinking, are there any implications at all for me about this? And I thought, well, to the extent that it brings attention to Latin America, I guess it could be a positive thing, but otherwise I wasn't particularly moved. More broadly speaking, though, what does this mean, if anything, for the Catholic Church?
Well, it has brought to light one issue that I think is going to get a little bit more airing, although it appears as though Bergoglio was on a slightly different tack, and that was the very cozy relationship that the church had with a rather ruthless Argentinian government in the late 70s and early 80s that went about disappearing some 30,000 people. Now, it has been reported in a couple of different sources that he was instrumental in hiding people and keeping them safe from harm. But it does also play into, other regimes. For example, we wouldn't even have a Vatican were it not for Mussolini separating it out as a country in exchange for the church looking the other way during World War II. So there's a lot still to be learned about this new pope.
Right, and then as a counter to what you said, about hiding people in Argentina. Back in 2005, before the conclave that elected Cardinal Ratzinger, in which Bergoglio finished second, there was a human rights lawyer who actually filed a criminal complaint saying he was complicit in the 1976 kidnappings of two priests by the Argentina military dictatorship. So conflicting information there for sure. Talk a little bit about...
Yeah, at the very least, it's always been this very strange shroud over this church. I mean, whether it's on financial sides with the Vatican bank ties to organized crime or to others, I mean, it is something that they really need to conduct themselves much differently moving forward.
I mean, I think at this point, some of the main concerns that obviously people think about when we talk about the Catholic Church are child molestation, position on equality, right, gay rights, and position on birth control. Certainly on equality and on birth control, there's really no indication that we have anything but the status quo here. On child molestation, from the research I've done, this particular cardinal was not on the list of the, I guess we could say, the most acutely known perverts of the Catholic Church, but not being on that list, I don't know how much that really means.
I'm not sure either, to be honest, David. I mean, if you look at also the other cardinal from Argentina who finished third in the balloting in 2005, if I remember correctly, he was, that particular cardinal was very much involved in the administration day-to-day of the Vatican. So I think his hands were a little bit dirtier than Bergoglia's, the now Pope Francis. I just don't see major changes. But the one silver lining in all of this is the fact that that this particular cardinal comes from the Jesuit order. And I'm not Catholic myself. Full disclosure, our family was at a very young age, and we left the church and moved over to the Episcopalian or Anglican church, and I've not been practicing for a number of years. What I do find is that there's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy when it comes to these particular areas. And although he may not have a history or may not be on the list, he is now in possession of the papal report that was given to Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, before he resigned.
Right.
And what he does with it will be very important. It's why I'm surprised, quite frankly, that they didn't go for, say, an American like Sean O'Malley. I don't think Dolan ever had a chance. He was a bit too bombastic. But O'Malley is the one who's navigated his way through and done an admirable job of settling and taking care of many of the abuse cases that happened in the Boston Archdiocese.
Right. I had this completely unrealistic fantasy when I was watching, the proceedings yesterday when the curtain started moving, so to speak, in the Vatican. Imagine if he came out and said, right away, the child abuse ends today. But it's completely unrealistic to think that there's going to be anything even remotely that bold, right?
Well, I think because it's so insidious and it's such a deep and interconnected web touching so many people, and I use that word very carefully, it is almost unrealistic. I mean, we had a guest on our show, and he's coming back next week, Dr. Britt Minshall, he came out with something very, very interesting, talking about the expectations of the one area, which is celibacy. And to take a bunch of very, very young men, put them in seminary in their early 20s at the height of their sexuality, and expect that they're not going to act on that is unrealistic, just as it is 40 years later to say you were bad 40 years ago, or maybe in some instances, in many instances, you are still misbehaving.
Right.
I mean, there's so much that's been swept under the rug, and I thought that the real affront was to see the Los Angeles Cardinal Mahoney there as part of the entire proceedings.
Absolutely.
That was the height of hypocrisy.
I actually have a friend who left the Catholic Church but was in seminary at one point. I won't say which one in the country just because, just to maintain privacy, but he said not only was nobody there celibate, 80% of his colleagues or classmates were gay. and that it's just completely unsurprising to anybody within the Catholic Church that's just the reality of the situation. But there's that hypocrisy, which is perfectly fine. However, publicly we have this incredible anti-gay stance, and the third thing we didn't touch on yet, which is birth control. So many people in developing nations not using birth control specifically because the Catholic Church is against it, and the amount of disaster that leads to, it can hardly be measured.
Indeed, and it's just, I mean, and not only that, but the guilt by association that goes with, if for some reason you have a medical reason to use contraceptives. The church can make you feel such a tremendous shame for taking care of your own health in this particular area. Again, it's the height of hypocrisy.
All right, we've been speaking with Dennis Campbell. Please check out Dennis Campbell on YouTube, youtube.com/worldview show. What's coming up, Dennis?
Well, we've had a busy week in the airline industry, but next week we've got some very interesting folks coming on the program as well. We've got Juliana Forlana, which is Absurdity Today. She's going to be on our program, as well as the woman who writes the Hill Navigator column about when Democrats and Republicans start having relationships with each other on Capitol Hill, particularly their staffs. So that should be quite fun.
All right, youtube.com/worldview show. Subscribe free. Make sure not to miss any of the videos. Dennis, we'll talk to you next week.
Looking forward to it. See you next week.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
St. Patrick's Day is this weekend. Lewis, will you be celebrating?
I guess.
Are you even at all Irish? Anything at all?
No.
No, me neither.
Okay.
Okay, next story. No, St. Patrick's Day is interesting. It's named after St. Patrick, who lived from 385 to 461, commonly recognized as one of the patron saints of Ireland. And St. Patrick's Day. For Christians, it commemorates St. Patrick and the arrival of Christianity in Ireland. And it's really become a pretty secular thing, right? We're just, in the U.S. at least, people just use it as an excuse to drink.
Pretty much, yeah. That's all it's become in this country.
I was thinking it's kind of interesting how right now, like, there's a big St. Patrick's Day parade in our area, and there's a number of big St. Patrick's Day parades. And everybody participates, right? It doesn't apply to just people who are Irish, but years ago, Irish were considered second-class citizens. They weren't even really considered white, right? In other words, Irish was separate from what at that time was white. And now, of course, Irish people are considered white. Maybe there's some groups, some outrageous racist groups who say, oh, no, Irish people aren't white and neither are Italians. But now the Puerto Rican Day Parade seems to be the one that the racists are annoyed by. In the past, you used to have anti-Irish racism, and now it seems to be the Puerto Rican Day Parade. People are annoyed by that, and that one hasn't gone as mainstream as the St. Patrick's Day Parade.
Well, Puerto Rico is the United States.
Yes, well, that's very true, but you know that racism and xenophobia knows
no logic,
no logic nor political boundaries, for sure.
Right.
Natan, do you think that St. Patrick's Day is at this point, what type of a holiday do you consider it?
A drinking one.
So you think that that's really the main thing?
I mean, most holidays in the U.S. are really just excuses for drinking, but this one and, I don't know, Cinco de Mayo, as people pronounce it, those two are definitely the ones that are almost exclusively for that purpose.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people, tons of people, I don't want to generalize. There are many, many, many people, Irish and not, who know the origins of St. Patrick's Day. But there are also many, many, many people, Irish and not, who have no idea what it is really that the celebration is about.
Right. Neither do I.
As applies to probably most holidays, right? I mean, in other words, growing up, even in Hebrew school, I think there were a lot of people there who didn't really know what a lot of the Jewish holidays were about.
Oh, of course. Yeah. Definitely.
So in that sense, it is well in line with a long tradition of traditions for the sake of traditions.
It's a very American thing.
It's quite a tradition.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Even though it's Irish.
What's that?
No, I mean the tradition of...
Traditions without knowing why.
Traditional reasons, yeah.
Of course.
The cannibal cop has been found guilty. It's also exposed a bizarre fetish porn site where people apparently talk about cannibalism. XBiz.com is reporting that New York City police officer Gilbert Valley was found guilty of conspiring to abduct women for the purpose of cooking them and cannibalizing their corpses. Also charged with illegally using a police database to target potential victims. So he used the police database to find women, which then he dreamed of cannibalizing. Seems like a hell of a guy.
Wonderful. Wonderful that people like this are protecting us.
The center of the case was the adult fetish website, darkfetishnet.com, where there's somewhere between 4,000 and 40,000 registered members who talk about their fantasies of eating women. And this officer's now estranged wife says she caught bizarre cannibalistic images on his computer and that this seemed to be a disturbed individual. I find the most interesting question here one of, are we bordering on thought crime here? In other words, the defense in part was these were unrealistic fantasies that he was never going to carry out. And part of the guilty verdict is based on the fact that, no, it was more than just an unrealistic fantasy, that there was a real threat here, and he also broke the law by using the police database to contact people, so on and so forth. I mean, to put another example, if you work at a chemical supply company and you visit websites at home about bomb making and you start using your work database to look at where you could obtain some of these chemicals easily, right? Is that terrorism? Is that, if the point of making the bombs was terroristic, is that enough to get you in trouble? You haven't made a specific threat, and really it's about what's the credibility, right? To some extent, it's an issue of credibility. This is a little different because he wasn't, there were specific women that he had been looking up. But I don't know, is this not, Natan, going in the direction of thought crime?
Well, I think that's what's going to be hashed out during the trial. I mean, it seems like he did commit some crimes.
Well, he's been found guilty.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. So
you're saying during individual trials in these types of cases?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's clear that, I guess it was clear to the jury that he was actually conspiring to do this.
Yeah.
He had certainly committed some other crimes that are beyond question, like illegally using the police database. So I think that this is not really a thought crime. It's just a factual question of whether they're actually planning it or not.
I think had he never used the database, come up with a victim list, and then communicated with some of the people on it, I think he would have never been charged of anything. Maybe
you're right. Maybe it's that made it the most real to the jury because he actually used official resources to find people. Find people, yeah. Let's go to voicemail. Voicemail number is available 24 hours a day. The number is 219-2-DAVID-P, 219-2-DAVID-P. Here is a voicemail about whether there is such a thing as a perversion of Christianity. Take a listen to this.
Yes, hello, guys. This is Rob in Texas. I'm calling to say that I think that there is a very basic problem when you start calling anything a perversion of Christianity. There are somewhere on the order of 40,000 different Christian sects worldwide. This is the kind of thing that's expected to happen when your worldview is based on a fiction. So, when your holy book promotes slavery, genocide, the treatment of women and children as chattel, and, the eternal torture for being human, how do you actually go about perverting that? Maybe by being moral?
Okay, so the argument here is, listen, you have so much negative, violent nonsense in the holy text of Christianity anyway. How can we really call groups like the Family Research Center and those groups perversions of Christianity? It's just kind of on the spectrum of the things that came from Christianity. Okay, it's an interesting opinion.
Right, but not to say that, of course, there aren't reasonable Christians out there. There are.
Let's take a listen.
Can I just say something about that?
Yeah.
I would agree with this guy, and I would go further and say that a lot of the so-called reasonable Christians or reasonable religious people are generally people that basically don't toe the fundamentalist line. When you become a fundamentalist and not a secularist, you basically insert religion in daily life, and I think it's very hard to think that any denomination of any religion, if taken literally in a fundamentalist way, can be reasonable.
Good point. Yeah.
Fair enough. And one more voicemail. Take a listen to this.
Hey, Lewis, this is Laura from New York, and I just want to ask you if you could please show us the rest of your tattoo that's like peeking out from underneath your t-shirt. I'm really curious, and it's kind of distracting. I want to see it. I can't pay attention to the show until I do, so yeah. Thanks, and thanks, guys.
Okay, so there's actually an entire clip which looks in detail at both of Lewis's tattoos. It's on YouTube. It's one of our audience questions. You can actually, we have a whole playlist of audience questions. One of them is, what are Lewis's tattoos? Lewis goes into detail about the genesis of the tattoos. How long did they take to put together? Were they painful? What is the meaning? Who drew them? All that stuff is available online, Lewis. So I don't think we need to do another segment about it here.
Right, and there are memories on it, so I
That's
can't
right.
do it.
It's not really a
Not
PG-13
FCC friendly. Yeah.
That's right. That's why we had to do it on YouTube. So check it out, YouTube. Lewis's Tattoos. Become a member. We'll see you Monday afternoon.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.